Good afternoon. I am Eleanor Hines, one of the executive committee members of the Rainbow SIG. Welcome to everyone who's logged in to listen to our Pride edition of RC Psych weekly webinar in celebration of Pride 2020, the new normal. We are really happy to have over 500 of you registered to attend this webinar. Thank you all for joining us. We are living in strange, challenging and historic times, certainly unknown to me in my lifetime. In the current global crisis, everyone is struggling, but those hardest hit are, as always, the more marginalised populations and communities amongst us. It is also important to remember that in times of global crisis, there is frequently a pattern of increasing legal restrictions and discrimination against gender and sexual relationship diversity. As such, it is of great importance, now more than ever, to push ourselves to think, educate, and raise awareness of the struggles of diverse others, and celebrate both our differences and our similarities. To my mind, two major struggles for freedom and equality are taking place amidst the chaos of the pandemic. These are the Black Lives Matter movement, who have responded to the most recent, but by no means new, spate of police violence against Black and Indigenous lives. Hearteningly, this latest wave of protest has carried its voice to what seems to be a larger and more broad audience than it has thus far succeeded in moving in recent memory. I'm afraid to reflect that our panel today is not particularly racially diverse, nor indeed as gender diverse as it could be. And we will be pushing the RC Psych and ourselves in the Rainbow SIG to investigate the reasons underlying this, whether that relates to policies that may indirectly discriminate against certain groups of people, or indeed the lack of diversity among our own executive committee. As a SIG, we will be discussing how we can improve the diversity of our executive committee at our AGM on the 1st of July. So please do come along, log in. The other struggle, equally as fraught, is that for the rights, safety and protections of trans people. I note the only questions we have received thus far in advance of this talk relate to trans healthcare, making me think there is a particular need for further education in this area. In the last week, both the US and UK governments took steps to remove protections against discrimination of trans people. The UK government has chosen to sideline the results of the Gender Recognition Act consultation, which was looking to improve the process of legally changing our gender. Whilst the government also looks set to instigate something akin to the US bathroom bill, allowing policing of trans and gender non-conforming people using gendered toilets. Whilst in the US, there were attempts to remove the protections of trans people against discrimination based on sex in the provision of healthcare. These struggles are all interconnected. I firmly believe in the importance of Pride as a protest. I recognise that it was started by Black trans women and sex workers, and believe in the need for it to work toward raising awareness of injustice. To further this work, research and evidence are needed to support meaningful changes in policy. All the while, we need grassroots programmes that continue to support this process through the year and create ways to improve the lives of those who have faced a lifetime of discrimination. Today, we have three excellent speakers who will talk to us about the epidemiology of mental health in gender and sexual minorities, how grassroots organisations are supporting LGBTIQ mental health through sports, and we will end on revisiting the history and importance of Pride, indeed Pride as both a protest and a means of community making, and how this is currently affected by lockdown. We hope to have about 15 minutes of questions after all our panellists have finished. Please do send in questions as they occur to you. We will endeavour to respond to as many questions as we can in that time. And after the webinar, we will aim to give feedback on questions we might not have had time to deal with. So Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Gemma Lewis, a psychiatric epidemiologist at the UCL Division of Psychiatry. She researches the causes, treatment, and prevention of common mental health problems, with particular interest in these in children and young people, and sexual and gender minorities. Gemma.
Thank you, Eleanor. Okay, so hi everybody. So as Eleanor said, my name is Gemma Lewis, and I'm an epidemiologist at UCL, the Division of Psychiatry. And I'm going to be talking today about being LGBTQ+ and what the research tells us about mental health. And next slide. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about during the talk, I'm going to start just by going over what we already know about mental health in sexual and gender minorities, based largely from population health surveys. I'm then going to talk about some new data and some new findings and some new directions that our research is going in, particularly that we've been conducting within our team at UCL. And then I'm going to finish by discussing some directions for the research field going forward. So just a note on the terminology that I'm going to use. I'm going to use the term sexual minority, which is a term that is used quite widely in the research field in this area to include anybody who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning, or anybody who has feelings of attraction for members of the same gender. I'm going to use the terms transgender and gender diverse to include people whose experienced gender does not align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And I'm going to be using the term or the acronym LGBTQ+ as well throughout the talk. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what we already know. If I can have the next slide. So I'm just going to provide some background on where we are at the moment in terms of our research on sexual orientation and mental health. So questions about sexual orientation have been included in our large representative general population surveys since around the time of the 1990s. The Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey in 2007 was the first UK national health survey to ask a question about people's sexual orientation. And at this time, it's fair to say that there are many studies, many high-quality studies, in fact, on the prevalence of mental health problems in sexual minority compared with heterosexual people. Next slide. Now, in contrast to that, just to provide some background to the state of the evidence and research on gender identity or expression, unfortunately, questions about people's gender identity have not been included in many. In fact, I'm not really aware of any national health surveys at the moment, particularly in the UK, which have included questions about people's gender identity or expression. So as a result of this, there are far fewer studies of mental health in transgender and gender diverse compared with cisgender people. And in terms of the studies in this area which are out there, I think it's really important to point out that the quality of those studies at the moment is a problem. So most studies that exist on the mental health of transgender and gender diverse people tend to be very small, and they tend to be of convenience samples, and they also tend to have no cisgender comparison group. So this is a gap that researchers across the world are currently working to address at the moment. Next slide. So I just wanted to have a look at, just provide some references for the most recent and comprehensive reviews of the evidence that is already out there. So there was a systematic review conducted fairly recently in 2015, and then another updated one of depression or common mental health problems that was conducted in 2016. Next slide. So in terms of what the key findings from these reviews of all of the existing evidence so far were, there's very consistent evidence that sexual minorities are at increased risk of a range of mental health problems. And these mental health problems mainly include depression, anxiety, eating disorders, particularly in younger people, self-harm and suicidality, and also drug and alcohol misuse. So it's important to point out that probably the vast majority of studies group all individual sexual minority categories and groups and identities and attraction levels together. However, the studies that have been large enough to look at individual groups and dimensions separately have found very consistently that all groups and all dimensions of sexual orientation, so by that we mean behaviour, attraction and identity, are at a higher risk of all of these mental health problems compared with heterosexuals. Something else that has emerged fairly consistently across the literature, which we know from our reviews, is that bisexual people, and in particular bisexual women, do appear to be at a higher risk of depression and substance abuse mental health problems compared with other sexual minorities and, of course, compared with heterosexuals. I just wanted to point out as well that one kind of important finding which has emerged from one of the reviews is that the associations between sexual orientation and mental health were larger in older adults, so adults who were aged 55 and over. Next slide. So this is just an example. So I also wanted to point out the most recent reviews of the mental health of transgender and gender diverse people, even though there is a huge paucity of research in this area. So I just wanted to draw your attention to these two. So a review that was published in The Lancet, and also a review of studies that have just been conducted in the States. And I think even though that study is not a global review, and still worth taking a look at if you're interested, because the vast majority of studies on trans mental health have actually been conducted within the United States. Next slide. So in terms of kind of the headline findings from these reviews, I think it's just really, really important to point out that the kind of headline message is the lack of high quality studies, really. So it's still important to note that based on the small unrepresentative convenient samples that we have seen, the prevalence of mental health problems in transgender and gender diverse people is likely to be very high, and it does look to be very high despite the poor quality of these studies. And I just wanted to highlight this quote from the Lancet review that few population level data exist with which to monitor the health of transgender and gender diverse people worldwide, because routine national and international health surveillance efforts in most countries do not assess gender identity or expression. Okay, next slide. Now, I did, despite obviously, for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, there isn't much out there in terms of trans mental health for us to synthesize, but I think it's really important to just pick out some of the higher quality evidence that we do have access to. So I just wanted to highlight these data from something called Project Life Skills in the States, which looked at psychiatric diagnoses and comorbidities in a diverse multi-city cohort of young transgender women. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of the finding, so this was a cross-sectional study of just under 300 transgender women who were aged 16 to 19. And it was from Project Life Skills, which was a HIV prevention study in Chicago and Boston. And what you can see here is the reported prevalence estimates, so how common these mental health problems were within this group of transgender women. And you can see that the estimates are all very high. So 15% of the sample met diagnostic criteria for currently having depression. 20% of the sample had reported or experienced suicidality within the past month. I think within the past 6 months, 8% had experienced generalized anxiety disorder and 10% had experienced PTSD. And we have a prevalence also, 6-month prevalence, I think, of alcohol dependence of 11%. So obviously, as we'd expect, very high prevalence estimates of mental health problems within this group. Next slide. And here we just have some data that I wanted to highlight from the Youth Risk Behaviour Survey, which is quite a well-known, high-profile survey of health within the States, and this was conducted in 2017. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, so data. Okay, so just under 18,000 students were surveyed in 2017, and the students had a mean age of 15. And the the young people were classified as either transgender, which was 1.3%, gender questioning, which was 1.4%, or cisgender, which was 97%. And what you can see just to my left here is the data or the estimates for suicidal ideation. So in the first yellow box, you can see that compared with the cisgender group, which was the comparison group, the transgender young people and the gender questioning people were estimated to be at 4 times the risk of suicidal ideation compared to the cisgender people. And just on the other side, you can see the data for suicide attempts. So this would have been a smaller group, so the estimates are not as precise, but you can still see that compared to the cisgender group, the transgender young people were 6 times as likely to have attempted suicide, and the gender questioning group was 3 times as likely to have attempted suicide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to go over some of the data that have more newly emerged from our research group. Next slide. So I'm just going to present some data which is just under review for publication at the moment. So it would be great if the next slide, the next few slides could not be shared. Thank you. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what we've done within our team at UCL very recently is that we've compared data on depression and anxiety in the adult psychiatric morbidity surveys that were conducted in 2007 and then 7 years later in 2014. And we pulled these data sets together to result in a large sample of over 10,000 individuals that was nationally representative of England. And what we found actually was that mental health inequalities between sexual minorities and heterosexuals had not changed at all in size or in magnitude from 2007 to 2014. So compared to heterosexuals, bisexual and lesbian and gay people were more likely to have depression and anxiety with an estimate of around 3 times more likely to have depression and anxiety compared to heterosexuals. So unfortunately, our evidence is that mental health inequalities have not narrowed despite obvious increases at a societal level in social acceptance. Next slide. And this is a paper that I wanted to draw attention to because a very similar finding, but this time applying to young people. So this is a paper by Rebecca Amos from the University of Liverpool. Next slide. So Rebecca and her colleagues used the Millennium Cohort Study, and they looked at mental health, social environment, and health-related domains in sexual minorities compared with heterosexual adolescents. And the Millennium Cohort Study is a large contemporary and representative cohort, and they looked at over 9,000 14-year-olds who answered a question about sexual attraction. Next slide. So this is possibly a little bit too small to see, sorry, but yes, so in the first yellow box there, you can just see that those red lines indicate odds ratios and the vertical line indicates 1, which is the null value. So you can see that the sexual minority adolescents were 4 times as likely compared with heterosexuals to be experiencing depressive symptoms that exceeded a proxy for a clinical cutoff. And if we just look at the second box, I wanted to point out these data on wider social influences, which I think are really important and not looked at well enough. So in addition to the mental health problems, what Rebecca and her colleagues found was that the sexual minority adolescents were 2 or 3 times more likely to report not being close to their mother, not being close to their father, experiencing arguments with their parents, with their siblings, and bullying, of course, which we know about, and physical assault and sexual assault as well. Okay, next slide. And this was a paper that we did recently within our team at UCL. So we tracked the emergence of depressive symptoms in sexual minority compared with heterosexual young people in a large cohort study of adolescents who were recruited and living in Bristol, born in Bristol in the 1990s, and have been followed sequentially over time up until the present day. Next slide. And the next slide. Okay, so what we can see here is that we've, going along the bottom, we've got the various ages of the adolescents. So we started assessing their depressive symptoms at 10 years of age, and they've been followed up regularly, so 11, 12, 13, all the way up to 21 years of age. And then we've got predicted depressive symptom scores on the other axis. So you can see ranging from 4 to 9. The red line shows the depressive symptoms within sexual minorities, and the blue line shows depressive symptoms within heterosexuals. And if I just draw your attention to the vertical yellow line, that was when we asked these young people about their sexual orientation. So that's when the young people reported what their feelings of identity were at that particular time. But we decided that since we had access to all of these data over the entirety of the lifespan between 10 and 21, we would look at trajectories of depressive symptoms between those time points. And what we found was this finding that actually, if you look back in time at the natural history of depression in this group, then actually the sexual minority young people were experiencing more depressive symptoms than the heterosexuals from a very young point in adolescence, and this disparity grew around the time of puberty and then becomes larger and is largest at the age of 16. Okay, next slide. So the meaning of this finding is we thought was that mental health disparities between sexual minorities and heterosexuals are present early in adolescence. And it's worth pointing out that a very similar finding has also been reported in a Dutch cohort called Trails, and also in an American cohort which isn't published yet. So it does seem that this finding is being replicated. So sexual minority adolescents in the UK consistently experience more depression throughout the school years up to young adulthood. So prevention and early intervention are a priority. And these kind of early universal interventions are supported, we think, which would target and aim to reduce minority stress and also heteronormative environments. Next slide. So I just wanted to conclude by providing some directions for this field going forward. So hopefully it's obvious that we need more high-quality population-based data on mental health in trans and gender diverse people compared with cisgender people. There's also a paucity of global studies in middle and lower income settings. We also need much more high-quality research on intersectionality, including sexual and/or gender identity and race and ethnicity. We also need more high-quality longitudinal evidence on developmental pathways. And it's very important to point out that LGBTQ+ people continue to experience stigma, discrimination, and violence, and robust evidence on these mechanisms, pathways, and timings. Although it may seem, common sense to us, what the causes of this mental health disparity are, I do think it's important that we continue to produce evidence, or that we produce future evidence on mechanisms, pathways, and timings in order to support and galvanise societal changes, and also to guide and inform the development of public health interventions. And it's also really important that future research involves and is co-produced with LGBTQ+ people. Okay, so next slide is just a thank you slide. So that's it, and I'll hand back to Eleanor to introduce the next talk.
Thank you so much, Gemma. Moving swiftly on, I would like to introduce Hugh Torrance, who has been the Executive Director of Leap Sports in Scotland since 2015. Prior to this, Hugh spent 8 years as a youth work director for LGBT Youth Scotland, and has had a varied career as a social worker for people with disabilities and young people prior to that. Hugh is co-president of the European Gay and Lesbian Sports Federation and co-chair of Pride House International. He's going to be talking to us today about supporting LGBT mental health through grassroots sports. Hugh.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today as part of the panel. Next slide. Very quick overview. Leap Sports is Scotland's LGBTI sports charity. We were founded back in 2010, and our mission is to remove the structural, social, and individual barriers that prevent people from accessing, participating, and excelling in Scottish sport. And there's a deliberate and important emphasis in there on the different spheres in which inequality exists. We also exist to eradicate LGBTI phobia within sport. And that's deliberate again, as we don't just talk about homophobia, which as an umbrella term can be quite limiting and misses biphobia, lesbophobia, transphobia, interphobia. Next slide. So the other part from our mission, which is quite deliberate, is accessing, participating, excelling and enjoying sport. And there are issues to tackle at all parts of that sporting pathway. It's not just about trying to get people engaged in the first place, but it's about sustaining that and right through to performance in elite sport. Leap Sports does that by working at the confluence of sport, community engagement, equality and human rights. Built on the foundation of sport as both a human right as recognised by UNESCO, the Human Rights Council and Principle 4 of the Olympic Charter, and also as an access gateway to other rights and benefits. I see my slides just slowly appearing there. So far from being a niche area of our work, if you like, our work takes account of a kind of broader sports landscape, and it encompasses physical activity, individual fitness and pursuit, and also recreation as well and outdoor activity. And there's a lot of very strong evidence which can link these activities to positive outcomes in not only physical health, but mental and emotional health, and also sexual health too. So outcomes such as feeling better, improving confidence, increasing resilience and coping, improving self-esteem and decision-making, reducing risk-taking behaviours. Being able to access sport and all of the different skills and outcome benefits associated with that also gives us as individuals a really important suite of empowerment strategies. Strategies around our bodies, many people in our community able to use sport and physical activity to reclaim bodily integrity, to change the shapes of our bodies in accordance with our identities. And actually for many of our trans community, that might also be about fitness to transition as well. And let's not shy away from the sort of structural and political components of sport as an important part of society and culture, and how that confers status, how it relates to rites of passage, how it supports power and enables opportunity. Depending which part of Scotland you live in will depend which sport you had to excel in as a young person in order to become a man, or to become part of the group, for example. So to summarise, equality in sport is not just about opportunities for people, it's also about much more than that. With the limited time that we have today, I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail about the projects and programmes that we run. Suffice to say that the areas of work that we do are represented on this slide, and all of our projects and programmes are built around the outcomes that you see here. What I thought I might do today to try to link better to the Pride debate and discussion is to perhaps debunk some of the key challenges that we often get. And I'll try to include a few examples of our work as I go along and do that. And I've also used lots of different pictures from our projects to show you the range of what we do, and perhaps even taunt myself a little bit about how little we're able to do right now. Next slide, please. So the first one, is LGBTI equality not quite well advanced? Why is Leap Sports even needed? This is quite a common challenge. I would say that we get this from somewhere at least every week. And I think that we really need to understand LGBTI phobia and discrimination better, as it's often understood really only in terms of either the presence or the absence of targeted hate speech or actions. I was speaking to someone recently who is a member of an LGBT running club in Glasgow, and they wanted to join as a volunteer. And they said, we love what you do. I think that you know, the cause that you're working towards is excellent, and I'd like to volunteer, but I've never been discriminated against in sport. And so I said, why do you do the 50-mile round trip that you do twice a week to come and run with this LGBT sports group? And they said, oh, I don't really like the changing room thing. There's a kind of banter thing that often goes on that I'm not comfortable with, so this is a better option for me. And I think understanding that actually discrimination exists at many different levels is something that can be missed in the kind of crude way that it's discussed, particularly in media terms. A very quick snapshot of some areas of the work that we do in relation to that. 15-year-old trans girl in the north of Scotland competing in gymnastics. She can't wear the expected tight-fitting clothing when she's competing because it's too revealing, and she gets tournament points deducted for doing that because the clothing that she does wear isn't regulation. We've also got a gay man who attends football matches with his friends, and their season tickets are for a certain seating area. The season before last, in the stand behind, two guys continually shouting about being bent, you know, the kind of usual see when you're down there, mate, and so on. Neither he or his friends felt confident enough to tackle it, and he was uncomfortable about how to proceed without really kind of highlighting themselves. And then we've got a PE teacher in the Scottish Borders who wants to know how to open up the equality agenda in their school. And at their school, the girls still do hockey, the boys still do rugby, and they're worried that the head of department has openly stated that they've got no tolerance of lefty gay agendas. So these are just like a few of the snapshots of pieces of work that we've been involved in. And these are all 2019 and 2020 issues. This is not stuff that we were working on years ago. Next slide, please. Why does everyone need to know your sexual orientation? There's some kind of myth that, you know, your sexuality or your sexual orientation is not relevant within certain contexts, whether that's sport or the workplace. And I just really want to dispel that, actually. I've lost count of the number of times over my career, over my life, in fact, where I've heard people saying, straight people don't feel the need to tell everyone that they're straight, so why do gay people? Or why does it always have to be so in your face? And I'm sorry, but every time I hear people talking about where they went with their wife at the weekend, or when I see a lovely picture of someone cuddling their boyfriend above their desk, or actually probably more as a screensaver these days, I'm showing my age, then actually that sexuality is in my face. You know, that sexuality has become relevant in that setting and in that workplace. And that's because, you know, we don't see it. Heteronormativity is a default position most of the time, and that means that, you know, heterosexuality is the assumed status of normality unless it's otherwise stated. And so guess what, you know, if that's not my normality and someone asks me about my missus or you know, my life, I'm going to have to state it. And within the context of sport, you know, anyone who says that sexuality is not relevant in sport has obviously never opened a UK newspaper or a magazine. We have a national obsession about who's dating who in this country. Next slide, please. Okay, I get the gay, but what about all of the other letters? I mean, LGBTIQ plus is not a homogenous term. You've seen already from Gemma's presentation, there are different terms. And to consider other components of identity as well, coming from class, gender, race, ethnicity, even faith, they all contribute to an incredibly varied experience. And that's also true of rights and experiences of discrimination as well. In my own area of work, gay people experience barriers in sport incredibly differently to how intersex people experience barriers, for example. And so any consideration that we make of the relevance of Pride in 2020 also needs to take that into account. Back in 2018, we commissioned two queer people of colour to do some work for us. We like to play with the boundaries between sport and culture and arts. What that led to was a gay bar and nightclub in Glasgow threatening us with legal action because we had the audacity to allow a space where racist door policies were called out, and it sparked quite a row within our community about what is and what isn't an LGBTIQ issue when it comes to the issues that we can protest about. And it is fair to say, and it was great to hear Eleanor talking at the beginning of the presentations today about the importance of Pride as a protest, because there is this continued discussion about whether we should or should not be continuing to protest around particular issues in Pride. Next slide, please. Why do we always need rainbows and flags? Just knowing that there are other people who are openly LGBTIQ can go a long way to making you feel comfortable. Having visible indicators such as flags or charter marks or supporting campaigns and so on, it's a useful starting point. It validates your identity. It can often make someone feel they're welcome in a space. And it allows you to know that it's the place that you're going, or the thing that you're involved in is perhaps not just a case of, we all know that there's gay people here, but no one really ever talks about it. We actively support these issues. I had a very powerful lesson in that visibility as a young social worker, and back at that point I was wearing my scrap Section 28 badge, and that probably tells you the rough age that I am now. And that very small act was enough for a colleague to approach me and say, "Can I have a word with you?" And I'm constantly amazed by the power that such imagery and visible gestures can genuinely have. I also think many of us have grown up in such a culture of shame around this that the kinds of things that I'm saying are often things that I'll hear other LGBTI people saying as well. The fear of not standing out, or being seen to be different, being seen to be a troublemaker, is it's very much a feature of many of us in my generation. Next slide, please. It doesn't matter who you are, we're all equal here. I've been thinking a lot about this one recently, particularly in light of the Black Lives Matter discussions. And, I think having a wide mission around equality is an honourable thing, but we can only implement positive actions to address inequality if we're willing to acknowledge and understand how and where that inequality exists in the first place. We can fail to understand lots of very specific issues unless we're willing to and open to see those. And for a minority identity person to hear that we're all equal here doesn't necessarily say that your fears or your concerns are going to be understood in that environment. I was asked to do some training last year for a hockey club, and when I was doing the prep work, their committee told me that our club is actually, we have a great track record on equality. We're all equal here. We don't discriminate against anyone. And so I asked them whether they thought that their LGBTIQ members would agree with that statement. And they said that they weren't sure because they didn't know if they had any LGBTIQ members. Now, I don't have a research background. I'm not the best person on this panel to comment, but I would guess that the statistical probability of having someone with an LGBTIQ plus experience in a membership of 422 people was quite high. And so, of course, that had to become the starting point for the work that we did with that particular club. Next slide, please. I've been very bad in not actually taking myself here at all, so I might be running out of time, so I'll just keep this one quite simple, I guess, by saying that having someone leading on equality matters is great and it's important, but it is never a way that allows us to absolve our own responsibility for equality. Final slide. Just want to finish by saying that I really welcome any discussion about the new normal, but I think that we have to start that by contesting the idea of what normal is, because let's face it, I don't believe that my community have ever really been the old normal. And on that note, I'll finish and hand back to Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugh, for that lovely talk. Finally, I will move swiftly on again to Will, last but not least, Will Fox, who volunteers as Director of Volunteer Engagement for Pride in London. In this role, he oversees the recruitment, training, engagement and well-being of 250 year-round volunteers, as well as 1,000 on the day of Pride. Will is a communications professional who has helped to drive progress on LGBT and broader inclusion issues at UPS and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Will.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So I don't want this to be a history lesson, but I think this really ties into particularly what Eleanor said at the start. It ties into the modern day. The modern Pride movement started in New York in 1969 by queer people of colour, and particularly Black transgender women. It's a movement that still goes on, and Pride in London was the first Pride in Europe, and in 2022 we'll be celebrating our own 50th anniversary. Last year we recognised the 50 years of queer revolt. You can see that in the photo, one of the photos that we've used last year in our campaign, and it's something that really drives us as an organisation today more than ever. Next slide, please. And the reason is because Pride matters more than ever. In 2018, we launched a survey, and we surveyed about 2,000 people, asking them what Pride means to them and why Pride matters. And I won't go into these statistics; you can read them on the screen. But this shows you, how important and how diverse the community is in terms of LGBT equal rights. It's particularly stark when you look at the battle for equal rights, between the comparison between gay and transgender and queer. And only 6 months after Pride in London in 2018, there was an attack, an assault on a couple for holding hands on New Year's Day 2019. This was 2:30 p.m. in South Bank in London, and this just shows you, how important it is still now more than ever to have Pride for the community. And as Eleanor said, Pride is very much still a protest. Next slide, please. When we talk about Pride, and when we ask what Pride means to people, they mentioned celebration, parade, diversity, unity, activism, protest. And the numbers of people that said protest and activism, BAME members of the community said that more than the white members of the community. Equally, 50% of the transgender respondents said that it was more activism. Compare this with 46% of bisexuals and 39% of lesbians and gay men. And you can see that particularly for the BAME members and the transgender members, transgender and non-binary members of our community, there's still so much to get done. And on this slide, this was done in 2018, and the numbers, are still will be very different if we did this today. But it shows that, there is a huge amount that needs to be done in raising awareness of the issues that are faced by the LGBT plus community, whether it's linked to health, education, discrimination. And it shows the importance of webinars like these and the allyship within the community, but also with straight allies. And those straight allies can be a big support and a big voice as we try to get towards that equality. Next slide, please. So what would have been Pride next week on the 27th of June. Obviously, it won't be happening. The faces that you see on the Piccadilly light screen are the members of the core team. We have over 250 volunteers that volunteer their time, effort and enthusiasm to make Pride in London happen. We are contracted to put on a march and to put something on in Trafalgar Square. But as Pride in London, as an organisation, we see that we need to do much more than that. And that is why we are a year-round organisation, doing things in communications, community engagement, having year-round events, because we really want to provide a platform for all members of the LGBT plus community. Next slide, please. And obviously, COVID-19 and the last few months and weeks even have changed everything for Pride in London as an organisation, for our volunteers, but also for the LGBT plus community. And if you look at the impact of COVID-19 on the LGBT plus community at large, being stuck in houses where you live, with often little support and no escape, is tough for the LGBT plus community. And as we heard before about mental health, but it also goes into other areas. Nearly 25% of the young people who risk homelessness are LGBT. because they face rejection by their families for being LGBT+. There is a greater number of cases of isolation for the older members of the LGBT+ community. And the LGBT Foundation saw a 30% increase in the domestic abuse and violence calls once lockdown started in the UK. Obviously, for a volunteer group as Pride in London, COVID-19 meant that a lot of us were either furloughed or made redundant and became unemployed, or that our day jobs made us working harder than ever. And for me, as the Director for Volunteer Engagement, it was really making sure that their well-being was at the forefront of what we were doing, particularly because so many of them had been working towards Pride in June this year, and obviously we've had to postpone that. But not only that, every year we have over 1,000 volunteers who help to volunteer on the day, whether it's on the parade route to help fundraise or at many of our different stages around the footprint in London. And those volunteers are not just LGBT+, but they are from the straight community as well. And they come from all over the UK, from Europe, from Asia. We had quite a few people flying over from Asia and also Australia last year just to volunteer on the day. And it's a really hard thing for us to say, sorry, you can't do this, please come back next year. Because for them, volunteering on the day, but also for the LGBT+ community to attend on the day is something that is really special for those reasons of well-being, of protest, of marking the day, of the battles won and the battles still to be won and to be fought. And obviously in the last month and last few weeks, we've had Black Lives Matter, and we've had the Gender Recognition Act, and our work with the transgender and non-binary communities is more important than ever. And it's something that Pride in London has been working on in the past few years, but obviously with everything in the media now and the potential just ignoring the reform and the many respondents that happened as part of the consultation is of great concern to Pride in London and to the LGBT+ community. And the fact that over 30,000 letters were sent to the Prime Minister in 24, 48 hours after a news report on this is testament to what people think and what people believe and where we should be going. And Pride in London is always there supporting and providing a platform for all members of our community. Next slide, please. And that is why this webinar and everything that we do as an organization is so important. This year more than ever, yes, we are postponed, but we are still united. And in January, we launched a campaign, You, Me, Us, We, which was a rallying cry of allyship for members within the community to support one another. Little did we know what would happen after we launched that, but this cry for inclusion and allyship is stronger than ever. And that is why we have 30,000 acts of allyship, a campaign that we launched because then next Saturday would be 30,000 people marching in the parade. And we have asked people, no matter who they are, where they come from, to really show an act of allyship for the community, whether to donate, to be there for the community, to support them in different ways. We launched a platform initially called Coming Out. We rebranded it Staying In, for obvious reasons, which provides a platform for all different community groups to submit events, now digital events, so that people know where to go, so that they don't feel excluded and they can see that there are lots of different events that they can join and participate in. Something that we're really proud of at the start of the month, we launched the Unity Fund. This provides an opportunity for one-off grants to grassroots organisations to address the needs and the many needs of the LGBT plus community. And that's something that we've just launched. We're very proud of. And if there's one thing that I would ask, have a look at the new fund. Donate some money, because that will really help so many organisations who are going through so many tough times right now. And I wouldn't be the Director of Voluntary Engagement if I don't have a plug-in to volunteer. And we have year-round volunteer positions, but also to volunteer on the day. And it's something that is such a joyful moment for so many people to come together to see and to be part of Pride in London. And you also get the best seat in the house, being on the parade, watching all of the groups march past without you having to deal with the 1.5 million people that turn out for Pride in London every year. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity. Pride matters more than ever, and it's opportunities like these to discuss and to raise awareness of the important issues, particularly right now, that will help us for the future. And with that, I'll pass over back to Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Will. We're actually going to keep you online so that we can move into questions. I think we're going to get everyone in for questions. We got Hugh. So actually, I'm going to start with Gemma, because obviously questions have come in for each talk sequentially. So I'll start with Gemma, if that's all right. Would you say, is there evidence to support the expectation that increased societal acceptance of sexual and gender minorities is likely to reduce the incidence of depression and anxiety in this group?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing to actually test empirically in a study, I think. So we've had minority stress theory around for a really long time, and minority stress theory obviously hypothesizes or proposes that it's experience and exposure to stigma and discrimination chronically from a young age that leads to mental health problems in sexual and gender minorities. But actually physically testing that theory at a societal level is quite difficult. There have been really interesting studies which have looked at mental health problems and suicide rates before and after a significant event, such as marriage equality or something like that, and found that mental health problems in sexual minorities do improve after an event which signifies a transition in social or societal attitudes. So I would point out those studies. There's only a few of them, but they do show that improvements in mental health after large-scale population indicators of changes in social attitudes.
Great, thank you. Hugh, there are questions and concerns about how we can ensure fairness in competitive sports if room is made for gender to be more fluid in sport. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I mean, I suppose the kind of discussions around self-ID at the moment don't relate to the world of sport as it currently exists anyway, because within the Equality Act, which has been developed on the back of Gender Recognition Act clause, an opt-out anyway for sport. Okay, so in relation to people who have transitioned, then actually sport at the moment has a particular set of rules, and that isn't at the moment being renegotiated in any way, and certainly wouldn't be changing at all under any kind of self-ID scheme. But what I would say though is a lot of the science around this, and if you were to look at I've had the pleasure, if you like, of reading the several hundred pages of the CAS ruling around the Castor Semenya case, for example, and the science in this area is not terribly conclusive as it currently stands. Now, if you accept the science which is being offered, as being valid, as being non-biased, which I don't as it happens, but if you do accept that, then actually, despite that, lots of the rules still don't stack up at the moment. The logic between the current science, the over-reliance upon testosterone, for example, doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of rules that we have right now. So I think there is definitely room to change that. It's not up for debate at the moment, and legally that is, but the impact of it on grassroots sport is actually particularly problematic for our community. So what happens at grassroots level is people think, here's what the IOC are saying, here's what the Equality Act says, therefore this trans person perhaps can't play in this kind of regular football match or whatever. And actually we need to kind of really revisit all of that and get a grip on how community members access sport at a very grassroots level, because lots of those kind of big concerns around fairness don't necessarily transcribe to grassroots level, and perhaps are on dodgy ground anyway.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I was just also wondering, from your experience of working with the great diversity of people, Hugh, have you got thoughts on the diversity of our panel today and how it might have come about?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear to anyone tuning in today that, you know, we're all white faces on this panel, and that we are all coming from sort of fairly privileged positions within our organisations as well. I would say, and I think certainly, you know, when organisations, when the Royal College is kind of reaching out, looking for members to come and be part of panels, I think perhaps greater effort needs to be taken to find a better diversity of voices and experiences. I think there's a great degree to which some of us can, you know, be allies and make sure some of those experiences are fed into the presentations that we give, and that we can represent some of that in what we're saying. But that's not the same as the opportunity for people to come and to give that firsthand. So certainly, I would certainly be recommending that more care and attention is given to that area. And also, I think what I understood from talking to folks from the Royal College is there are actually some really good policies that would enable us to, you know, make that offer and invite people in to speak. And perhaps that's not very well known.
Thank you. Okay, I have another question here. The outcome of our 2019 qualitative research suggests that there is a significant gap in the area of therapeutic support to LGBT Black young people, especially looked after children 15+, in their transition from childhood to becoming adults, and in dealing with the effects of childhood neglect or abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional, which sometimes lead to the young person's struggles. The local authority will naturally employ the services of therapists who know absolutely nothing about that child's cultural heritage. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on the approach? I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's I suppose I'll comment from a mental health perspective, but I'm not a clinical person. So as a non-clinical researcher, I'm not sure really. That sounds like a very important study, and that's all very important points. I think it is you know, a wider issue perhaps that there's not enough therapeutic tailoring towards you know, the needs of the LGBTQ+ population, and I know that that's something that emerged from Liz McDermott's Queer Future Studies, where she surveyed young people, and that was something that young people expressed, was more understanding and more representation at a clinical level of their needs and things like that, and that obviously applies to issues of race and ethnicity as well, and that intersectionality.
Thank you. I mean, I'd also like to comment that I think there's a split between what people in psychiatry do believe and whether there should be therapists who, is it about education and raising awareness of therapists to know more about a diversity of cultures, whether it's race, religion, or gender and sexuality, versus should they actually be catering in terms of their own identity. I certainly know that there's Pink Therapy, which is a counselling service which will have people who identify in a certain way, so you can choose your therapist via their sexual identity or gender identity. Okay, so moving on. Returning to Gemma again, we are seeing an increased rate of gender dysphoria in young people, with a shift in prevalence towards female to male transition. Can you speak to why this might be?
Yeah, I'm not sure really. I mean, I'm not sure as far as I know, well, it's a fact actually, we know very little about the true prevalence of people who are transgender, gender diverse, gender dysphoria. We know, there's no population-based data on it really, so the true prevalence is not known. I assume the person is talking in terms of clinical presentations, which I know, have gone up. In terms of why they've gone up, I think that's, well, common mental health problems, self-harm and suicidality is going up in the youth population overall at the moment. And as Eleanor pointed out when she introduced the talk, such increases in mental health problems in the population will disproportionately impact marginalised segments of that population. So it could be that, those young people are experiencing an even bigger increase in their mental health problems than the rest of the general population, which is also increasing. I guess it's also driven by increased discussion and conversation and awareness of gender dysphoria as well, which probably will act as a catalyst for young people and families to seek help. But I'll just finish by saying that we don't really know the true prevalence in the general population.
So I'm going to stay on the topic of young people. Do the panel feel the age of transition to secondary school is a particular area of difficulty to youngsters?
There is a whole body of research on school transition and mental health, and school. There is, or I haven't looked at that, this evidence for a while. But actually, when I was doing my PhD, there was fairly good evidence that school transition can lead to increases in mental health problems within the general adolescent populations. Obviously, that applies to sexual and gender minorities as well, for whom it may be even more difficult due to the added stresses and pressures within that population.
Now we're sort of coming towards the end. I don't know if either Hugh or Phil have any, or Will, sorry, have any further comments you want to make, or any comments you want to make on any of the questions so far. Nope. Some final questions have come through, which I don't think directly relate to the talks, but there is one question on: is there treatment available to those who find their attraction to same-sex distressing and are seeking psychological support?
Can you repeat the question, sorry?
Is there treatment available to those who find their attraction to same-sex people distressing and are seeking psychological support? I would say yes. I would say psychotherapists and psychologists will guide you through that difficulty if you're finding that distressing. But there is no longer what would have been called aversion therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Made illegal.
Yeah, sorry, I was just slightly confused by the original question, but yeah, just to reiterate what Eleanor said, obviously, there's a huge provision of psychological services and psychological therapies available for sexual and gender identification as a source of, source of confusion and psychological stress and mental health problems. But just to point out that obviously sexual and gender minorities are in large part experiencing a normative reaction to, heteronormative environments.
And I might also just add to that the huge numbers of support groups and kind of local youth organisations that are particularly targeted organisations. Mermaids, for example, offer some support to families and as well as kids around transitioning issues, for example. And then we have a huge network of LGBT youth organisations right across the UK as well. And again, supporting young people to perhaps come back to a position where we're kind of analysing society's response and helping young people to kind of find their own self within that.
Thank you to all our speakers and to everyone who's attended the webinar today. We've had lots of questions, so we haven't had time for the panelists to answer all of them, but we will try to answer as many questions as possible, which will be available online in the coming days. Thank you all very much.